Hello, and welcome to the Evercore ISI Corporate Access Meeting with Aemetis, Inc. Speaking today from Evercore ISI will be Senior Managing Director and Partner James West and Director Todd Firestone. Speaking from Aemetis, Inc. will be its founder, chairman, and CEO, Eric McAfee. I'd like to remind everyone that the material in this webinar is based upon information considered to be reliable, but neither Evercore ISI nor its affiliates guarantee its completeness or accuracy. Assumptions, opinion, and recommendations contained herein are subject to change without notice. Past performance is not necessarily indicative of future performance. This material is not intended as an offer or solicitation for the purchase or sale of any security, and we will not be disclosing any non-public information. Our speakers will be taking questions via the questions window on your webinar control panel. Please type your questions in at any time during the presentation. And now I'll turn the microphone over to James West.
Thanks, Diane, and thanks everyone for joining myself and Todd and Eric today. We're pleased to be joined by Eric McAfee, the founder, chairman, and CEO of Aemetis. Aemetis, Inc. is an advanced renewable fuels and biochemicals company focused on the production of advanced fuels and chemicals through the acquisition, development, and commercialization of innovative technologies that replace traditional petroleum-based products by conversion of first-generation ethanol and biodiesel plants into advanced biorefineries. The company's strategy is to lead the renewable fuels industry transition to below zero carbon intensity inputs from non-food, low-cost agriculture and forest waste sources to maximize California low carbon fuel standards, U.S. renewable fuel standards, and of course the IRS 45Q credit values. Eric founded Aemetis in 2006 and is a true Silicon Valley entrepreneur and venture capitalist with a lifelong commitment to agriculture and renewable energy. He was the founding shareholder of the 1.6 billion revenue Pacific Ethanol, which is now Alto Ingredients, funded by $85 million from the Bill Gates Cascade Fund and $150 million pipe raised at about $1 billion valuation. He was also the founding shareholder of several publicly held energy companies, including Evolution Petroleum, Pacific Asia Petroleum, Particle Drilling Technologies, World Waste Technologies, and SolarGen Energy. And Eric has funded more than 25 companies as a principal investor and has founded 7 public companies with a combined high market value of $4 billion. He is the founder of McAfee Farms, Organic Almonds, an organic pastures dairy company, the world's largest raw milk and cheese producer, creamery, bottler, and distributor. And he was appointed a Global Scot by the President of Scotland in 2012 and has served 26 years as elected board member of the California Manufacturers and Technology Association. Eric graduated from the Harvard Business School Private Equity and Venture Program, the Stanford Graduate School of Business Fast Growing Company Executive Program, and served as entrepreneur in residence at the Wharton MBA program. He also holds a BS in management with statistics emphasis from California State University of Fresno. So Eric, welcome and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, James. Thank you very much for that long introduction. Usually you don't get introduced with that kind of flair.
Well, I figured it was appropriate. So maybe to start off, Eric, you and I have talked recently, and Todd recently, but maybe for our audience, could you give us the elevator pitch for Aemetis? What was the opportunity here that you saw?
We are transitioning from non-renewable feedstocks that are primarily carbon-intensive petroleum and coal and petroleum natural gas. It's in the ground, and when we turn those into valuable products, we emit carbon into the atmosphere, which has contributed to global warming. So the Aemetis sales pitch is simple. We need a siphon in the opposite direction. We need to take carbon from the atmosphere, turn it into productive fuels and chemicals, but then capture the carbon emissions and sequester them in the ground. Essentially a reverse siphon of what the fuels industry, the petroleum fuels industry, and the utility industry does today. And we think that's a massive market. I think eventually the synergy between oil and gas and utilities and renewables will be very clear to all industries. We're essentially a part of the oil and gas industry, enabling them to use these low-cost, readily available molecules by reversing the climate change impact that some of these molecules can affect.
Right. Well, maybe could you walk us through the 3 generations as you see it of renewable energy and where Aemetis sits in this pool?
I think it would be helpful perhaps to take a quick look at a PowerPoint slide here. And this this first generation, second generation, third generation construct, I think is very important for investors. Most investors think of renewable energy and they think of solar and they think of wind and primarily electricity. So first generation renewable energy is fundamentally using solar energy. And that produces, of course, our entire industry of solar panels, wind, but also, frankly, hydroelectric. When you think about where water in rivers comes, that goes into lakes and creates electrical power, and indirectly nuclear. But this does not absorb carbon from the atmosphere. A solar panel doesn't, a wind machine doesn't. These are industries that deserve trillions of dollars of investment. We should see them, though, as slowing the rate of climate change. They do not reverse climate change. They slow the rate in which every operating coal plant or oil refinery or other carbon emitter is being needed for the production of electricity and fuels. Second generation is all of our biofuels industries today, the ethanol industry, the biodiesel industry, renewable diesel industry, renewable aviation fuel. These are all very productive and second generation because they not only use solar energy to grow a plant, but also absorb CO2. CO2, H2O, and sunlight is photosynthesis. So nature on a massive scale is absorbing CO2. But what we see as a third generation is needed, where we use sun's energy, we absorb the CO2, but we sequester the CO2. And the sequestration of the CO2 is what creates that reverse siphon that's essentially doing the opposite of what the petroleum and utility industries largely are doing, especially as we burn things like coal to make electricity, to be able to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere and then sequester it in the ground as a part of us making, for example, electrons for electric vehicles. One of the things we'll talk about today is our dairy biogas business at negative 426 carbon intensity. We're absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. It goes into a plant. The plant is eaten by an animal. We capture what otherwise would be methane released back into the atmosphere, and we sequester it. And so doing, we're taking the world's lowest carbon intensity fuel, which is biogas that can run trucks, or it can be converted into electrons to run electric vehicles. But then we're capturing the processed CO2 that comes off that 40% of biogas is actually carbon dioxide. By capturing that carbon dioxide and sequestering it underground permanently, we are acting like a siphon of carbon from the atmosphere into permanent storage.
Eric, it's Todd. Maybe I'll take a stab at one, and maybe just kind of high level is we've had a couple other calls, with management teams in this space, and we find that there's quite a bit of investor education that I guess is part of the process. But maybe we could talk about just the tax credit landscape and how Rand's your outlook on the RIN market pricing. Same thing with California's LCFS and 45Q. So maybe kind of a high level view on how those are set to impact your economics.
Well, good. I think we're all kind of in the same world, which is that these tax credits and California LCFS opportunities are here and are here to stay. So on this slide, what we talk about here is the actual financial impact using biogas as the initial example of the California and the federal policies. So bullet point number one here is going back to that dairy renewable natural gas. We have a negative 426 carbon intensity. Diesel and gasoline are in the mid 90s to 100. Petroleum natural gas is positive 100. We're at negative 426. So if you look at that, every million British thermal units generates about $142 of revenue. Of that $142, only $2 is the value of the actual molecule net back to the plant. So if we were to be in the business of just producing natural gas and we were to deliver that to a customer after paying the pipeline transmission and the fueling costs and other things, we're only going to see about $2 per MMBTU. The other $140 per MMBTU comes from approximately $35. That's the federal value. Today it's actually up a little bit, so it's about $38 an MMBTU from the federal D3 renewable identification number. So if you look at the bottom here, it's sort of a stair step where we start at the D6, which is an ethanol molecule, advanced biofuels D5, all the way up to the D3, which is on the right. And so in the federal renewable fuel standard, passed in 2005, expanded in 2007. As we reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel that we're producing, and frankly, as we move toward these waste biomass, cellulosic kind of fuels, the value of the renewable identification number increases. So we get today about $3.20 per gallon of ethanol equivalent for what was only a year ago about 80 cents of value under the D3 RIN. So this has driven a lot of investment appetite toward carbon negative renewable fuels such as dairy RNG, which create the D3 RIN, the one on the far right, rather than the ethanol D6 RIN, which is on the far left, which today is about $1.80, up from about 30 cents a year ago. So it's been a dramatic increase in D6 RIN value, but $1.80 versus $3.20 means that getting a D3 RIN is tremendously valuable compared to getting a D6 ethanol RIN. And then the California LCFS is worth about $105 today. Again, this is California's own regulatory environment incentivizing producers to produce low carbon biofuels. And so the $105 comes from the fact that we have a negative 426 carbon intensity, and you multiply it through to what the metric tons are that you have. And right now it's about 1.6 cents per single carbon intensity point. And we have negative 426 of them compared to positive 95 for gasoline and diesel. Obviously, we're generating a whole lot of value when we get a carbon intensity that's so negative. So you stack those three together, LCFS 105, about $35 to $38 of federal D3 RINs, and then the $2 of the actual molecule, and you end up with $142 plus value for dairy biogas, obviously driving a tremendous amount of investment appetite into how you can expand that kind of an opportunity.
Eric, maybe one more. What do you tell investors who perhaps or maybe have questions on upcoming capacity additions and how that might affect either RIN or LCFS pricing?
Well, interestingly, there's three markets I just described: the actual physical molecule, the federal policy, and the state policy. What I didn't describe was the 45Q, which is sequestration. There's no practical limit to any one of those policies. The IRS does not limit the 45Q and say, once we get to $1 million of tax credits, there are no more tax credits available. It's essentially an unlimited opportunity. The other factors, capitalization, permitting, construction, those are the actual constraints in the 45Q sequestration. The physical molecule itself is a very big market of all electric vehicles. The entire transportation industry is an opportunity for the physical molecule to be delivered. So let's talk about the federal D3 RIN. There's effectively no limit there. The original law back as in RFS2 in December 2007 stated that they intended to have 16 billion gallons equivalent, B with a billion, of ethanol by the year 2022 from this D3 RIN. It was going to be larger than the ethanol business at 15 billion. Our actual deliverables this year will be a few hundred million, even with all the biogas and all the cellulosic ethanol all put together, is a few hundred million gallons. 300, I think, is where we'll end up. So 300 million with an M versus 16 billion with a B means that there's no practical limitation how many D3 RINs you can generate either. And then in California, the California regulators have been remarkably consistent at expressing their desire and then enforcing their desire that projects are able to rely upon a price roughly in the $200 range plus the cost of living index since the policy has been in place. This year, it'd be about $225. And they've expressed concern when the price has gotten near the limit. And they've actually, August of last year, had committee meetings talking about how they would give utilities additional LCFS credits to make sure the market didn't overheat and end up having kind of a broken mechanism where the credits were too expensive. And likewise, they've had committee meetings, February 2019, where they increased the number of LCFS credits required every year. This case was for 10 years, 2020, 2030, because they saw that there was a need for increased demand. So they're regulating this to be a predictable number, somewhere in the $200 plus cost of living index range, that project developers, financiers and the entire trading market of LCFS credits can rely upon. The one thing I would mention is in April of every year, there's an auction, and there's a strange 3 or 4 week decline in LCFS demand that occurs around that auction, and then it comes back. And it's been confusing to investors. It happened again today, this year. It's a predictable decline and increase. It's simply the demand for the credits goes away temporarily, a couple weeks during the time of the auction, and then it comes back. Other than that little anomaly, which I don't think the regulators really have figured out how to deal with, it's a very reliable market and unlimited. This is where people get a little bit confused. We have a negative carbon intensity fuel molecule, and we could use a whole lot of LCFS credits very, very quickly. And all the regulator needs to do is say, you know what, this sounds like we're achieving the impact on climate change we're seeking. Let's go ahead and require, instead of a 1.25% decline in carbon emissions, let's make it 1.5%. And in so doing, they're expanding the market for LCFS credits as we achieve our investment goals and, of course, deliver more LCFS credits. So it's a very synergistic relationship between project developers and the regulators, in that we're achieving their goals. And quite frankly, they, by assisting us with the stable market for LCFS credit pricing, can assist us in executing on our goals. And that is a stated objective. But this is no hidden arrangement. This is stated by them. That's their goal, is to provide us a market for LCFS credits that we can rely upon for project financing. And they fully understand if they do not execute well on achieving that relatively stable market, then we can't execute well either. So it's I think California now is in its 10th year, just celebrated the 10th anniversary of the low carbon fuel standard market. And it's proved as a template that probably will be adopted broadly throughout the United States over the next 3 or 4 years, as they're seeking to have the same positive climate effects in other states and potentially even at the EPA.
So Eric, I know in reading the Biden's budget here recently that he is looking to expand and extend the 45Q tax credit, but there were some nuances in there that I wasn't sure if it was going to be helpful to you or not. What's your reading of the current proposal?
Reading is it's not any worse. I wouldn't say it's much better. Okay. I think that it's pretty stable policy for us. They are clearly trying to tweak it a little bit to help out some of the industries. Coal comes to mind. But I'm not also really very sure that what's currently being proposed is going to look much like what's going to eventually pass. Sure. There's a couple of filters that need to happen that haven't shown up yet.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. So how does a typical contract work with a dairy farmer for you guys?
Well, let's take a look at one of our dairy farmers real quick here, and we'll flip through a couple of these other slides to get there. But in general, our ethanol plant supplies about 80 dairies, approximately 100,000 dairy cows with animal feed, about 2 million pounds per day, moved by roughly 50 trucks out to dairy farms. So we've been doing this since 2011. We are the largest wet distillers grain producer in the state of California, and technically the largest animal feed producer in the state of California, which is a byproduct of our ethanol business. And so a typical dairy farmer relationship is that we're already giving them the feed that's producing the biogas when you really want to think about it. It's just nobody's capturing the biogas yet. And so the previous business models have been used over the last decade or so in making electricity from biogas, has been the developer asking the dairy to prove their commitment to a long-term relationship by putting up some of the money, usually putting up most of the equity. And then the developer brings in grants and brings in loan financing sometimes. And that's the way the deal comes to pass. It's kind of been a broken business model, proven by not a lot of deployment of the biogas to electricity sites in California. So we took the approach that we need to take all of the capital budgeting, all the permitting, all the construction, all the operational activities as an Aemetis renewable fuels activity. The dairy's job is to frankly produce the biogas. That's their job. And they do that very well. They have large lagoons that currently bubble methane gas into the atmosphere and produce 25% of all the methane emissions in the state of California. So we essentially signed two agreements with the dairy. They're kind of in one combined format, but it's a lease on the real estate for 25 years plus the construction period, and it's a supply agreement for manure. That's really what we're signing, is a supply agreement saying, you go milk your dairy cows, you wash your pens, etc., and we'll take care of everything else. And we go out and we build a football field sized lagoon, has one layer above and two layers below to do a good job of capturing what could leak in the groundwater. We put in a hydrogen sulfide cleanup unit. This takes away a lot of the smell and, frankly, a lot of the toxins in the biogas. We then pressurize it at the plant, at the dairy, and we put it into a pressurized pipeline, take it to our centralized location where we're building our centralized gas cleanup unit. But what's unique about it is that we already use about $8 million a year of natural gas. So we use this biogas today and have been for more than a half a year, and actually making lower carbon ethanol. So we went to the California Air Resources Board and said, we want to use not positive 100 CI petroleum natural gas. We want to use negative 426 carbon intensity dairy biogas. And we'd like to prove that our ethanol is actually lower carbon. And they did. They gave us actually a lower carbon score than we originally projected, negative 426. So we are producing lower carbon biofuel, and every day getting paid for the low carbon fuel standard credits for doing that. Now, why does that matter? It matters because if you don't own an ethanol plant, you cannot produce low carbon fuel standard credits until you have interconnected with the Pacific Gas and Electric utility. And that process of permitting and interconnection and everything else can go on for years easily. And so that's enabled us to very confidently move forward. Already spend $30 million of equity. We have no debt at all in our subsidiary. That's the Aemetis Biogas subsidiary. Spent $30 million of equity, built 2 dairy digesters, 4 miles of pipeline, been producing now for over half a year, have 32 miles more that are already approved under the California Environmental Quality Act, already broke ground on our gas cleanup. We're running an operating business, generating revenue already, and did that all within really 12 months of launching the project. We were able to get our first dairies online.
And Eric, how does the almond business play in with your whole strategy?
Fundamentally, the almond business is a very interesting business in that the waste product after 20 years of operating almonds is a pile of wood sitting in the field, essentially. And we're using that in 2 very important ways. Number one way is that we're using it to fuel our jet and diesel fuel plant. And the byproduct of that jet and diesel process is that carbon that originally was in the atmosphere was captured for 20 years in the growing of this orchard, gets put into making cellulosic hydrogen, making renewable hydrogen to make jet and diesel fuel. But the carbon from that we sequester in the ground. So it goes directly to this thesis of how do you siphon carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and into the ground? Well, you start with a plant that for 20 years was absorbing CO2 and H2O and sunlight, capturing it all in the one place. That in Central Valley, California, we have over 1.5 million acres of almonds and walnuts. Every year, 1/20th of that is turned into waste. Capture that, we're capturing the carbon. And then we are in a very unique position in which we can sequester that carbon in the ground and end up with a carbon negative feedstock, which we carbon sequester the CO2 component of it. So it's very synergistic to our jet and diesel business, but also, frankly, our carbon sequestration business. And we can talk more about the jet and diesel business, but quite frankly, the carbon sequestration component is that 3rd generation of renewable energy that increasingly I think investors are going to start asking, okay, this is interesting. You're using this renewable feedstock. That's very interesting, but are you sequestering any of it? And is it costing you $2 billion to run a pipeline for 1,000 miles to get to a place you can stick in the ground? Or like the California location where our 2 ethanol plants, jet and diesel and ethanol plants are, we're right over the top of a formation that has been determined as one of the best geologic formations for sequestration in the world. It's saline, so it's essentially a salt water reserve with a cap and a basement, and we're sitting right over the top of it, so we don't have to put up a big pipeline over to get to that formation.
Well, maybe selfishly for me, because I still cover the oilfield service group, as you know, who were you working with on your carbon capture?
Baker Hughes, we've spoken to all the leading players, but interestingly enough, about 100 years ago, Baker Hughes was founded here in the Central Valley of California, and lots of experience in its formation with the Bakersfield area being major for, Chevron and Oxy and a bunch of other guys. So we found that they have the underground expertise in not only characterization of the various layers that we're dealing with, but the physical drilling aspect in Central California, they're very, very comfortable with, and describe this as being a very low risk execution for their company. So we're very pleased that they came on board.
Eric, maybe I can step back a little bit again and maybe just talk about the ultimate kind of size of the market for RNG, and what you see there. Maybe that's what's driven really remarkable kind of share price performance.
Yes, I think that people are beginning to appreciate that there's almost an unlimited opportunity over the next 5 years. There's over 1,000 dairies in California. The regulations clearly show that every dairy that's emitting methane over time is going to end up looking like what's on this slide, which is having a covered lagoon, not an open lagoon. And by doing that, you're capturing essentially all of the biogas that's being emitted from these lagoons. And the economics of this process is very capital intensive. We'll spend about $300 million on 52 dairies, but the cash impact of that is about $180 million a year of revenue and approximately $140 million of EBITDA. And it's under 25-year agreements. The dairies are participating with us in that cash flow stream as the LCFS prices increase, which are, according to the rules, set to increase at the rate of at least inflation. This EBITDA will actually increase. We modeled it without increases. So our view is that it's capital intensive. It requires a third party to come in. No single dairy can really afford to put an entire gas cleanup and a utility interconnect, the H2S cleanup, and the 3 million plus it takes just for a single digester. It could be easily $15 to $20 million for a single dairy, and that's not including any pipeline they have to build to get to the utility pipeline. Most of these guys are not on utility pipeline. So it could be 25 million easily for a single dairy to do what we do for them for essentially for free. I mean, I would tell you, we even give them a check at the signing. They get a substantial upfront payment. So we don't want them to have any costs. We pay for their legal fees. It's a partnership. Their job is to run their dairy. Our job is to monetize this waste stream, turning it from a liability where they will eventually become subject to LCFS credit liability. They'll have to buy LCFS credits, just like an oil refinery would. We're turning it from that into a revenue stream. And we think it's largely just an execution issue. If you own an ethanol plant, your execution risk is dramatically lower. You get revenues immediately. As soon as you get the biogas in your plant, you're generating revenues. And if you're not an owner of an ethanol plant, you've got to kind of risk that 2-3 years into it, you might still have no revenues. If the Pacific Gas and Electric Company hasn't quite built the interconnect yet, hasn't quite gotten their permitting together, there's nothing you can do to influence it at all. You're just sitting there waiting. And so we think that the 2 ethanol plants in California, that's us and another company about 100 and something miles south of us, both of us have built biogas units, and we're executing quickly and smoothly, and have obviously a lot of pre-existing relationships with the permitting agencies because we're one of the largest industrial companies in our county. And so it's been a very comfortable execution. It's our dairies. We already feed their cows, and we've known the guys for a decade, and the permits are in place now for us to execute on the next phase.
Okay. I can ask one more, James, and just on kind of who's the kind of customer demand growth? Where do you expect that? Is it going to be more utilities, or is it going to be heavy transport? And how do you see kind of RNG competing with renewable diesel for heavy truck transport, let's say?
I think this is the most interesting part of the dairy renewable natural gas business. When you think about it, over 25% of electrons in America come from petroleum natural gas. That's what we're producing. We're producing pipeline quality natural gas. You literally can't tell the difference once it's in the pipeline, whether it came from a dairy or came from underground in Texas. So turning that into an electron and then fueling, let's say, heavy transportation, fueling a truck, fueling a bus with electrons. So this is a battery operated bus run by a municipality, a battery operated truck with maybe a range extender on it. Those electrons can either come from carbon negative dairy biogas sources, or they can come from carbon positive. And I think a lot of people are aware that the zero emission is out of the tailpipe. That's interesting. But if you're producing electrons from coal in Ohio, you still have all the issues of acid rain and coal production and all the things that go into being a carbon intensive and environmentally hazardous feedstock to make electrons that run your nice, clean electric car. So as people become more sensitized to the fact that, yeah, you're right, my clean electric car actually emits more carbon than a gasoline car if I don't have a carbon negative feedstock for the electrons, I think that the people are starting to realize, wow, that's a big market for dairy renewable natural gas, is to actually convert it into electrons that are used in transportation. Specifically, by the way, we're incentivized to replace diesel transportation. So if you put it into a Tesla motor car, you get a 3.4 multiplier because you're displacing gasoline, and gasoline has a lower energy density than diesel. If you put it into a truck or a bus or some other diesel offset, it's a 5.0 multiplier. And I just want to highlight this for investors. That's a third of your revenue, right? 5.0, 3.4, that's roughly a third of your revenue is lost if you're not putting the electron into heavy transportation. So our goal has been to focus on decarbonizing heavy transport. You can think of this as long haul trucking, but any kind of trucking where you have a diesel engine that you're displacing gets the same kind of support.
That's helpful. Thank you.
So Eric, what are the kind of key things we should be watching with you guys, for the remainder of this year, 22 and beyond? There's a lot of projects in development here. What are the milestones that we should be targeting?
For the dairy RNG specifically?
Or for both, I guess, the company in general.
I like people paying attention to dairy RNG. Several other observers of our industry have basically pointed out that with us scaling up to 52 digesters, if you look on the far right there, by 2025, this is a business that ends up being tremendously positive cash flow, and it is a 25-year contract with the dairies. So as a base business, this is an easy one for people to come to know Aemetis, understand our advantages in the business, and kind of say, you know what, everything else Aemetis is doing is kind of upside. This core business is really where we can drive a lot of the market value of the company. And so if you look here at our revenue growth, the jet and diesel business is the blue bar, which generates a lot of revenues as we grow the business. The pink bar, of course, is being dairy RNG. But if you look at it from a shareholder value perspective, both our jet diesel business and our dairy business generate almost about the same EBITDA in our 5-year plan, which we announced earlier this year. So the dairy business being a 25-year business, we own the pipeline, we own the digester, we own the gas cleanup, we own the interconnect. We have, it's the whole thing is owned by Aemetis. It's a 100% owned project, but with 25 years of essentially what amounts to a manure supply agreement and a lease agreement at the dairy. I think we're going to get much higher multiples in that business. I'm not telling investors what to think, but that kind of a business with 25-year contract tends to be a pretty reliable business. Right. Exactly. Yeah. So my view is, okay, if we look at this business, and on this slide, we actually broke it out so people could look at dairy RNG. And if you look at adjusted EBITDA down here near the bottom for dairy RNG, you're 141 million in 2025. You take that and you apply some multiple to it, and it's up to you guys to figure out what the multiple is. But it's a 25-year contracted cash flow stream. And I think that the other businesses we have are basically upsides. Our current market value is less than $500 million and 140 million of EBITDA just from this business, only in the next really 4.5 years, and only at the rate of about 10 dairies per year. One of the things we get asked a lot is, if we have 80 dairies we're already supplying with feed, why are we planning to only build 52 over the next 4.5 years? Especially if there's almost 1,200 dairies in the state of California. And the right answer, of course, is this is a predictable, executable plan with financing to back it up, and you deliver on this and people will be satisfied. Of course, we'd love to have all 80 of our dairies online in the time frame we're talking about here, but nobody's going to complain if we beat this plan by a lot. And so this is a plan that I think is very easy to execute. We're actually putting 15 digesters in the ground in the next 12 months, but we're projecting only 10 digesters per year over the next 4.5 years.
Eric, this has been great, highly informative. If anybody on the line has questions, feel free to lob those in. But if not, I'll go ahead and, Eric, turn it back to you to wrap up any key items that we missed or anything that we didn't get to.
Sure, absolutely. I think we ought to talk briefly about our ethanol plant. And this is probably the least interesting part of the business to investors, but it is a core strategic asset that set us up for this dairy RNG business. And interestingly enough, set us up for carbon sequestration. This plant is right over the top of the shale formations down at 7,000 feet. So we don't have to build a $2 billion pipeline to get our carbon sequestration to where it needs to be. We produce about 150,000 tons of carbon dioxide that we already capture and we already clean up. We already partially pressurize it, actually. And so our ability to generate IRS 45Q credits has already been proved. We already generate $25 reuse credits under the 45Q using this asset. But we're upgrading it in order to basically demonstrate that you can change the carbon intensity of a traditional ethanol plant and end up with consistent positive cash flow and profitability because of those upgrades. So what did we do? We took a carbon intensive input, which is the petroleum natural gas, positive 100 CI, and the equipment that relies upon that. And within about a year, we'll use no petroleum natural gas at all. Our entire systems that relied upon petroleum natural gas will now run with what? Electricity. About 85% of the use of the energy is now being replaced by electricity, which enables us then to go to low carbon intensity electricity. And then the remaining 15% is this dairy biogas at negative 126 CI. So at the bottom here, you can see that by avoiding $8 million of petroleum natural gas purchases, literally buying it from 2,000 miles away and pipelining it into California, you get to pocket $8 million a year. That's kind of nice. But the reduced carbon intensity from using solar array with battery backup, we got an $8 million grant from the California Energy Commission, and we're installing that solar array this year. With battery backup, it gets to extend the time period in which we can use that zero carbon intensity electricity. By installing the ZBREX Mitsubishi ceramic membrane, this means that our dehydration of separating ethanol water no longer uses natural gas at all. It's basically an electric motor that pushes the ethanol and the water through a membrane. That's running at 70 plants worldwide, but they're potable alcohol plants, they're drinkable alcohol plants, they're smaller plants. This is the world's largest Mitsubishi implementation, and it's a strategic relationship we have with Mitsubishi Chemical. We are the world's first corn ethanol plant to adopt the use of this technology, but allows us again to use electricity. Where the electricity come from? From zero CI solar or low carbon grid electricity. And then mechanical vapor recompression is using the same steam that we created. In this case, we'll be using it from dairy biogas, but using it again, you're recompressing it, you're making it hot again and making it highly pressurized. And then lastly is high efficiency heat exchangers. You put this all together, and what we've just created is an electro fuels plant. We're using electricity as the input and rather than carbon intensive petroleum. And with this as a base, I mean, we obviously are going to enjoy the positive cash flow, but more importantly than that is we have a very low carbon ethanol that comes out of this product. And that low carbon ethanol means we produce low carbon corn oil. We are the largest distillers corn oil producer in the state of California. And so our business opportunity is to take that very low carbon corn oil, and I'm going to pass through carbon sequestration here, but you guys will be able to see this on our website if you want to come visit and take a look at it. We're actually using that distillers corn oil combined with the wood waste feedstock we talked about, and we're making jet and diesel fuel out of it. It's just the logical thing to do is to look around where we're at. We already produce the corn oil. We will be able to use more than what we produce, of course. We already have that base feedstock to make jet and diesel fuel. We have the waste material to make hydrogen. And so if you're sitting there and you had a lot of renewable oils and you have a lot of carbon negative hydrogen, what would you do? You'd stick them together. You would hydrotreat your oil. And that's exactly what we're doing. And so this is a very low technology risk process. Worldwide, Neste, Valero, Renewable Energy Group, the idea you take a renewable oil and you hydrotreat it to give it more energy is a very off-the-shelf technology. Our upgrade to it is that in addition to just being able to use petroleum natural gas, which we could use, no problem, we want to take a carbon negative feedstock, this waste, orchard wood, vineyard, forest waste input, make hydrogen from that. So we have a gasifier we got exclusive rights on that enables us to make a carbon negative, a negative 80 cellulosic hydrogen. Regular hydrogen under California rules is a positive 170. So we're 250 CI points lower than the carbon intensive hydrogen that comes from petroleum in the ground. And so when you think about hydrogen, you always have to think, where did it come from? Well, if it came from the ground, it was CH4. That's 4 hydrogens, 1 carbon. When you took the hydrogen away from the carbon ended up in the atmosphere as CO2. It gets emitted as carbon dioxide. And so we took hydrogen that comes from the atmosphere. Why? Because a plant absorbs CO2. We extracted hydrogen from it. It came from the atmosphere. And then what do we do with that carbon? We sequester it. That's our 3rd generation step, is right underneath the plant, there's this multiple layers of shale, and you can drill through a shale cap rock and sequester the carbon. So following that siphon rule of absorb from the atmosphere using a plant and then extract the hydrogen and sequester the CO2, we think we're going to end up with a carbon negative jet and renewable diesel. To our knowledge, the world's first carbon negative aviation fuel and renewable diesel. I'm probably just stating the obvious here, but the margins are excellent. When you use a carbon negative waste feedstock, which we have a 20-year contract on, the revenues here with our 2 phases completed in 2025 is about $467 million of revenues. EBITDA is about $136 million. And as a producer who's been in this business for over 2 decades, I can tell you it's about sustainable competitive advantage. The market would fluctuate, but if you have sustainable advantage of a negative 80 CI hydrogen and somebody else who's in the same business producing the same product has a positive 170 carbon intensity hydrogen, you're going to be operating long after pretty much every other operator in the industry is slowing down production. And in this particular case, we are generating almost 100 million of revenue when most other guys are struggling in this business. So it's a little harsh to look at the world that way, but I think it's a practical way to look at it. Is we're in the business of creating a lower carbon intensity business, and we're converting an existing site, Army ammunition plant, with 710,000 square feet of existing business buildings. But here's the really important part: we have 100%, essentially zero carbon hydroelectric power. So going back to that ethanol plant model, where we want to lower our carbon intensity by using solar, at this site we already have that. 100% of our power comes directly off of a reservoir up in the mountains, and it's 100% hydroelectric power. We announced we have 19 air permits and authority to construct on a big chunk of this project already. And so we're well down the road of being able to execute on making this happen.
Well, very exciting. This was great, Eric. I really appreciate you joining us today. Lots to digest there, lots of very informative, certainly from our standpoint. So thanks for joining myself and Todd, and we look forward to checking in again with you soon.
Yeah, thanks, James. Thanks, Todd. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
Eric.
Take care.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.